I'm Susan Yawkey with VOA's Middle East Monitor. Coming up, condemnation of the attack on the British embassy in Tehran.
Simply put, Iran needs to be isolated diplomatically and completely until they learn that they have to respect embassies.
A top U.S. official visits Iraq before U.S. troops withdraw. Calls for the UN Security Council to respond to Syria's deadly crackdown on protesters. And the U.S. expresses regret about Pakistan's withdrawal from the International Conference on Afghanistan. It's all ahead on VOA. Britain has ordered the immediate closure of the Iranian embassy in London and has closed its embassy in Tehran, following a mob attack Tuesday on British embassy compounds in the Iranian capital. British Foreign Secretary William Hague announced the decision in Parliament today. He said Iran's diplomatic staff has been ordered to leave the United Kingdom within 48 hours. He added that Britain's response is not an indication it is severing ties with Iran. However, he said the action reduces relations with Iran to the lowest level consistent with the maintenance of diplomatic relations. On Tuesday, British Prime Minister David Cameron said Iran faced serious consequences for failing to defend the British compounds from protesters who smashed embassy windows and ransacked offices as police looked on. Henry Ridgwell has this report from London.
Hundreds of students gathered Tuesday outside the British embassy in Tehran to protest against the sanctions, chanting "Death to Britain." Several demonstrators scaled the fence before ransacking the buildings. One protester appeared to be waving a portrait of the British Queen. Staff fled the embassy through a back door. Iran expressed regret over the incident. Britain's Foreign Secretary William Hague said that was not good enough.
We hold the Iranian government responsible for its failure to take adequate measures to protect our embassy as it is required to do. Clearly, there will be other, further and serious consequences.
Britain is urging its citizens in Iran to stay indoors and keep a low profile. The attack comes 2 days after the Iranian parliament voted to downgrade diplomatic relations with London. Last week, Britain strengthened sanctions against Iran, cutting all links with its banks. The US and Canada also tightened their sanctions. It follows a report from the UN's nuclear watchdog, the IAEA, suggesting Tehran is still pursuing a nuclear weapon. Andrea Berger of London analyst group RUSI says the report stretched the West's patience with Iran.
The diplomatic avenue in compelling Iran to renounce nuclear ambitions is perhaps not going to be pursued as actively as it may have been in the past, and that we may be moving towards increasingly harsh approaches such as sanctions.
Despite the sudden escalation of tensions, Berger says the IAEA report does not suggest Iran is on the brink of becoming a nuclear power.
The report's inconclusiveness of the current developments in possible military dimensions suggests that there is no smoking gun. However, that's no reason for complacency on the part of major countries pursuing policies such as sanctions.
Analysts say that in the space of a few days, Western relations with Iran have taken a dramatic turn for the worse. Henry Ridgwell for VOA News, London.
U.S. Secretary of State Hillary Clinton has condemned the assaults on the British embassy in Tehran.
The United States condemns this attack in the strongest possible terms. It is an affront not only to the British people, but also to the international community. And we stand ready to help in any way that we can to make the point as strongly as possible that governments owe a duty to the diplomatic community to protect life and property. And we expect the government of Iran to do so.
VOA correspondent David Gullist has more on the story from the U.S. State Department.
The attack on the British diplomatic complex in Tehran by what were described as hardline students evoked memories of the 1979 seizure and occupation of the U.S. embassy there. It drew a sharp response from the White House, which condemned the action in the strongest terms and stressed Iran's responsibility under international protocols to protect diplomatic missions and personnel. President Obama, in a photo session with Dutch Prime Minister Mark Rutte, said he was disturbed by what he termed the trashing of the British facility. Unlike the 1979 attack, in which more than 50 Americans were held hostage for more than a year, all British personnel were reported safe late Tuesday, though protesters entered offices, broke windows, and tossed documents around the grounds. State Department Deputy Spokesman Mark Toner said it was probably no coincidence the attack followed Britain's announcement last week of fresh sanctions against Iran's nuclear program.
They need to uphold their obligations under the Vienna Convention, and they need to protect the security and safety of diplomats in Tehran. It's hard to say, frankly, but we do believe, as we've said before, that taken in totality, that the economic sanctions against Iran are beginning to have an effect, as much has been acknowledged by President Ahmadinejad.
The UN Security Council approved a non-binding statement that condemned the embassy attack and called on Iran to fully comply with international obligations. Russia and China, which have resisted additional Security Council sanctions on Tehran, joined in the unanimous vote on the document. A senior State Department official who spoke to reporters said it was hard to imagine the attack did not have at least tacit support of some Iranian officials. Iran expert Michael Rubin, resident scholar at Washington's American Enterprise Institute, said Iranian police could have pushed the protesters back rather than giving way. He said the notion Tuesday's attack was spontaneous has no credibility. Rubin said Iran's Islamic government has a history of threats to diplomatic property in Tehran, and only a united approach by the world community can end it.
Ultimately, solidarity matters. Certainly, the Iranians have never been called to account for seizing embassies, be it the American embassy, being it attacking in the past the British or the German embassies, or now taking the British embassy. Simply put, Iran needs to be isolated diplomatically and completely until they learn that they have to respect embassies.
The former Pentagon official said Tuesday's attack in the wake of the British sanctions move suggests Iran fears economic isolation much more than diplomatic isolation, and that perhaps it is time to enforce both. David Gullis, VOA News, the State Department.
Are you looking for a comprehensive daily look at events reshaping the Middle East? Visit voanews.com/ME. You'll find VOA's original reporting from the region, in-depth analysis from our Washington team, VIP interviews, online polls, photo essays, and mini documentaries. Bookmark us or add us to your RSS reader. That's voanews.com/ME.
Egyptians have completed the first round of voting in the first parliamentary elections since a popular uprising forced President Hosni Mubarak to resign in February. The country's interim military leaders are hailing round one as a success and say voter turnout was high. No major problems are reported. U.S. Congressman David Dreyer was among the international observers who monitored the vote.
What needs to be done is we need to have a reaffirmation of the commitment to elections. This is process one, 2 more stages to go on these parliamentary elections, then the upper house elections, and then the presidential election. So, yeah, I mean, that's why I say this is a historic day in the 7,000-year history of Egypt.
United Nations Secretary General Ban Ki-moon is congratulating Egyptians for what he calls their enthusiastic participation at the ballot box. Voters cast ballots for the lower house of parliament Monday and Tuesday in Cairo, Alexandria, and 7 other provinces. Leslie Campbell is with the National Democratic Institute.
I have to give the Egyptians high marks for transparency, as you can see at this counting center and in the scenes here, with hundreds of people watching and poll workers counting in the full view of cameras and media and candidate representatives and so on. They're making a lot of attempts to make this a transparent process. That's a huge improvement from past elections, and so I'm cautiously optimistic.
9 days of clashes between protesters and police led up to the elections. 42 people were killed and 3,000 injured. Egypt's Islamists claimed today they were headed for victory in the opening phase of the country's first post-revolution election after 2 days of peaceful polling that won international plaudits. What would that mean for Egypt and its new constitution? VOA senior Middle East correspondent Mohammed El-Shinawi just returned from Cairo, and he joined me earlier today in our Washington studios. Welcome back, Mohammed.
Thank you.
We are waiting for the official results of the first round of the parliamentary elections, but what do Egyptians feel about the potential results?
Actually, so the Freedom and Justice Party, FJP, a Front for the Muslim Brotherhood, a moderate group persecuted and banned during the 30-year rule of President Hosni Mubarak, said they were leading in preliminary results. However, that was not a surprise to many Egyptians. But the real fear among moderate Egyptians, especially secular liberals and the country's minority Christian community, is that the An-Nur movement, whose members are hardline Islamists who follow the strict Salafi brand of Islam, came in second place. People are alarmed that this group of Salafis would impose a strict form of Islamic laws or Sharia laws that could threaten the liberal life Egyptians enjoyed for decades.
But there is no indication that Islamists would be an overwhelming majority in the upcoming parliament. There are other political parties and movements, so why the fear?
Because the first huge task for the new parliament would be to choose the 100-member commission that would draft the new constitution. So if Islamists win big, they could pick members who reflect their Islamic agenda, and that would impact the new draft of the constitution. However, there was a general understanding in Egypt that the Constitutional Commission would not only be composed of parliamentaries, but also members of civil society organizations and other groups. Actually, earlier this month, when I was in Cairo, the government issued a draft proclamation which said that members of parliament could only fill 20 positions and specified the groups and types of people from which the other members would be selected. This included a long list of representatives from various institutions like labor unions, professional syndicates, constitutional law experts, etc. The institutions themselves would submit 2 names for each of these positions, and then the parliament would make the final decision. But this meant that the parliament would only have limited sway over the commission's final makeup. At present, it's not clear that the fate of the draft proclamation is. It has not been officially approved, but also it has not been officially withdrawn. It is possible that the military would still intend to enforce these rules and safeguard the future of the Egyptian constitution.
Well, thank you, Mohammed, for your insight, and it's great to have you home again.
Thank you.
That's VOA Middle East correspondent Mohammed El-Shinawi, who has just returned to Washington from Cairo, Egypt. The U.S. and Germany say the UN Security Council must respond to Syria's deadly crackdown on protesters after UN investigators detailed grave rights abuses they say were ordered by the highest levels of President Bashar al-Assad's government. The U.S. ambassador to the United Nations, Susan Rice, said that the Arab League's recent decision to impose sanctions on Syria could impact UN deliberations.
And now, with the Arab League having acted and it becoming increasingly clear, even for those who would rather deny it, that the Assad regime has participated in outrageous and now well-documented atrocities, that the patience of its neighbors as well as the larger international community is evaporated. We think it's time to revisit the question of what might be possible here in New York.
A UN commission investigating allegations of human rights violations in Syria accused government troops of summary execution, arbitrary arrest, enforced disappearance, torture, including sexual violence, as well as violations of children's rights. The group's findings will now go to the Human Rights Council and the UN General Assembly, which will decide what to do next. U.S. Vice President Joe Biden has made a previously unannounced visit to Iraq. As VOA's Kent Klein reports from the White House, the Vice President has been meeting with Iraqi leaders about a month before a deadline for U.S. forces to withdraw from the country.
With the U.S. military mission in Iraq winding down, Vice President Biden went to Baghdad. The visit was designed to help shape the future of the relationship between the two countries. White House Press Secretary Jay Carney said the vice president's stop in the Iraqi capital shows that President Barack Obama is keeping the promise he made in 2008 to end the Iraq War.
We are withdrawing the remaining U.S. forces from Iraq, and we are ending that war responsibly and giving the Iraqi people the chance for a better future that they deserve, and also maintaining an important strategic relationship with Iraq.
A White House statement says the vice president made the visit to meet with Iraq's leaders and participate in an event recognizing the sacrifices and accomplishments of U.S. and Iraqi troops. In the meetings with Iraqi leaders, the vice president was expected to focus largely on the future of Washington's military relationship with Iraq. The location of Iraq between Iran and Syria makes it an especially strategic U.S. ally. Officials in Baghdad have said they want U.S. military training help for their security forces. U.S. officials are trying to determine how to help Iraq develop its abilities to fight terrorism. A suicide car bombing Monday killed at least 19 people at the gates of a prison north of Baghdad, and 15 people died from a series of explosions on Saturday. The trip to Iraq is Biden's 8th since taking office. The visit was added to a previously scheduled trip to Turkey and Greece. Iraqi Prime Minister Nouri al-Maliki is scheduled to visit Washington on December 12th. All U.S. forces are to leave Iraq by December 31st, under a security agreement the two nations approved in 2008. About 14,000 U.S. troops remain in Iraq, down from about 170,000 at the war's height. Almost 4,500 American service members have died in Iraq since the U.S. invaded in March 2003. The Iraq War is one of the longest military conflicts in U.S. history. Kent Klein, VOA News, the White House.
U.S. Secretary of State Hillary Clinton says she regrets Pakistan's withdrawal from next week's international conference on Afghanistan, but hopes to secure Islamabad's cooperation in the future. Clinton told a news conference in South Korea today that Pakistan, like the U.S., has a profound interest in a secure, stable, and increasingly democratic Afghanistan. The top U.S. diplomat said Islamabad and Washington must learn lessons from a NATO air assault that killed 24 Pakistani soldiers in disputed circumstances Saturday, so the two countries can continue fighting terrorism together. She pledged a quick and thorough investigation of what she called a tragic incident. Pakistani officials have said they will not participate in next Monday's meeting in Bonn, Germany, in protest against the airstrike. VOA's Kurt Achen has more on that side of the story from Islamabad.
Pakistani Prime Minister Yusuf Raza Gilani's decision to boycott the Afghanistan conference in Bonn, Germany, comes despite an appeal by Afghan President Hamid Karzai to reconsider. Because certain Afghan militant groups have ties to Pakistan's security forces, Pakistan's engagement is considered crucial to any future Afghan stability effort. U.S.-led NATO combat forces are scheduled to depart in 2014, meaning the window of time to negotiate a secure peace framework is rapidly shrinking. For many Pakistanis, the deaths of 24 soldiers killed in a friendly fire incident involving NATO warplanes and helicopter gunships are painful, and popular anger is mounting, with many Pakistanis calling on their government to sever its longtime alliance with the United States, despite billions of dollars in U.S. aid each year.
If you are hitting your own friends, what would you expect from your enemies, like Taliban? We are your allies. You should not strike us back.
Everybody in Pakistan is against it, and everybody, even in the tribal area especially, people are very unhappy, and they are going against the Americans, against Pakistan government if proper action is not taken.
Besides boycotting the Afghanistan conference, Pakistan has also shut down 2 overland supply routes that NATO uses to provide non-lethal supplies to its forces in Afghanistan. And it is seeking to disrupt the use of American drone aircraft in the Afghan war by ordering the U.S. to vacate an airbase in Pakistan. Drone attacks and civilian collateral damage are frequent irritants to the Pakistani government and citizens. Simbal Khan, a researcher at Islamabad's Institute of Strategic Studies, says the Pakistani government had no choice but to take a firm stand toward the U.S. and NATO.
What we are going to see is probably a change in the reaction as we move forward in dealing with this event. I think the future reactions and what you're going to see coming from the Pakistani government and from the people in the next 2-3 days is going to be dependent on the response from the US and from NATO.
Khan also says that NATO needs to better define the rules of engagement along the Pakistani border.
We want to kind of move forward in our relationships with the US or our international partners, providing certain safeguards are put in place which prevent certain incidents from occurring in the future.
The United States is leading an investigation into how and why the NATO aircraft fired on the 2 Pakistani military outposts. A report of the investigation's findings is expected to be complete by the end of December. Kurt Asian, VOA News, Islamabad.
Although young Indonesians might be familiar with the latest fashions, movies, and electronic gadgets, when it comes to basic knowledge about their bodies, they are not apparently as savvy. Kate Lamb takes a look at the state of sex education in the world's most populous Muslim nation.
Indonesia has one of the fastest growing rates of HIV transmission in Asia, but the majority of Indonesian youth could not tell you why. Data from the country's health ministry indicates that some 75% of Indonesians aged between 15 and 49 believe that HIV is transmitted by mosquitoes. Like many of her peers, 26-year-old Arianti Taman says she did not have any formal sex education while at school.
The only thing close is a biology class, and it was about reproduction, and that's it. So I got information about sex and issue related to sex, such as HIV or STD, were from newspaper, magazine, internet, and also from movies.
The world's most populous Muslim nation is socially conservative, and for many, discussing sex is taboo. But a more liberal approach to sex is putting pressure on traditional attitudes. A recent global survey found that nearly 40% of Indonesian teenagers have had sex, and almost half of them do not use contraception with new partners. While the government is reluctant to implement sex education into the national curriculum, Zoya Amirin, a prominent female sex psychologist, is taking the matter into her own hands. Amirin recently launched a weekly video podcast on issues related to sexual health and says she hopes it will help fill in the knowledge gaps.
Most of the research actually say that so many people learn from porn, asking from their friends, and they believe in myths. That's a dangerous thing. For instance, like they believe that by washing your genitals after having sex, especially washing your genitals using alcohol or something, it will prevent you from getting a sexual transmission infection.
The lack of basic information about sexual health and the prevalence of myth also runs parallel to the spread of HIV across the country. The National AIDS Prevention Commission reports that the rate of HIV infections is on the rise in several provinces, including Bengkulu, Papua Maluku, Aceh and Banten. Official figures show that some 70,000 Indonesians are HIV positive, but it is estimated the real figure could be as high as 300,000. For Arianti Taman, conservative attitudes need to catch up with modern-day realities.
I think lots of Indonesian people now are already sexually active, even though they're not married. It's just like seems that the society in general are just still trying to ignore that, like as if they still pretend that no, it's not happening, but it is happening. So you need to do something about it, as in make sure that if the young people do it, then at least they do it safely.
Although the government has been reluctant to introduce sex education into the curriculum, non-traditional educators like Zoya Amirin say they are seeing a change in public attitudes. Amirin says she has received an overwhelming response to her weekly podcasts and has even been pleasantly surprised by reactions from religious conservatives. While declining to name names, Amirin says several Islamic boarding schools have hired her to conduct sex education workshops this year. For VOA News, this is Kate Lamb in Jakarta.
This is VOA's Middle East Monitor. Join us Monday through Friday for news from the region and of interest to the region. Thanks for tuning in to the Voice of America.